Thank you, guys. Keep up the good work, and God bless you as you move forward, and bless us as a church as we engage, and even as Joseph asked, that together as a community, as we raise together in some degree, that the support and love and care for Kundwani would be great. So, if you were to tell me when I was a kid that I would end up being a pastor when I grow up, I would have told you and said, "You're nuts. You're crazy." And then if I were to, if you were to tell me that I'd be a pastor then for 44 years, I'm going, hello. And along with that, then to study theology and then psychology and then spend several more years in continuing education, and I would say, you need to see a doctor. You're nuts. And then if you were to tell me that I would leave the province in which I was born and which I loved, and to come and marry a beautiful teacher from British Columbia and move to this province, I would say, that's it. You're crazy. No more joking around. Come on, can't do this. Then if you were to tell me that I would operate a rabbitry with over 1,000 rabbits, and open a private counseling practice and work in addiction recovery and work at a street mission, and going, good grief, how many years do I have to live to do so much? And then in March 2022, working comfortably at a job that I was planning to retire from later that summer, and then to find myself serving alongside you here at Terrace Alliance Church. What on earth does that all mean? You see, we cannot see God's existence, right? We can't really see his existence, but we can see his hand working and orchestrating things in our life that we never even dreamt were remotely possible. You see, God's existence, and you don't have to go far, you can just go to the coffee room at work, and there you will hear that God's existence is challenged. There's no God. Like, what are you talking about? And we can be ridiculed by our faith, but I think it takes more faith to see life without rhyme or reason to it as merely some random chain of events that just happen for no reason at all. A series of coincidences just waiting to happen. And so followers of Jesus, I think, we get to see the bigger picture in things, not only in the big things of the frame of reference of the kingdom of God, but even the day-to-day finer details of life, we begin to recognize that God is at work and God is working in all these things. Even though we can't see him, something here reminds us that God is on his throne and he's in control and he is working out his plans for the greater good of all that he has created. You see, nothing catches God off guard. Nothing gives him anxiety. Nothing gives him a heart attack. My goodness, what's going on in the world? Nothing makes him throw up his hands in despair, going, what have I done? In fact, he will always triumph. He will always triumph. His ways are much higher than our ways and much better than our ways. And one of the things I've come to discover is that God saves the very best for the last. We just have to engage and work through some of the challenges of life to actually get there and to be able to see it. We have to hang in there long enough. And too many of us give up. We give up sometimes 5 minutes before we see the greatest miracle unfold. We give up. Our story today gives us a point of reflection to understand this premise that there really are no coincidences in life. No such thing. And so if you take your Bible, and I hope you've been reading through Esther faithfully, week by week, and here we come into chapter 6. If you remember last week, good old Haman, he's so ticked off at Mordecai, he's trying to figure out how to kill this dude. I got to get rid of him. I got to get him out of my life. That's what his friends suggested, and so he ended up constructing this 75-foot tall gallows to take him out of the way. So here we come into chapter 6, and it says, that night the king had trouble sleeping. And so he ordered an attendant to bring the book of the history of his reign so that it could be read to him. And in those records, he discovered an account of how Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the eunuchs who guarded the door of the king's private quarters. They had plotted to assassinate King Xerxes. What reward, then, the king said, did we ever give Mordecai for this? And his attendants replied, well, nothing has been done for him. Who's that in the outer court? The king inquired. As it happened, Haman just arrived in the outer court of the palace to ask the king to impale Mordecai on the pole that he had prepared. And so the attendants replied to the king, oh, Haman's in the outer court. Bring him in, the king ordered. So Haman came in, and the king said, what should I do to honor, or another word, delight, some of your translations, a man? What do I do to delight a man who truly pleases me? Haman thought to himself, who would the king wish to honor more than me? One day, a school teacher was going to explain evolution to her class. So she said, little Tommy, she said, do you see a tree outside? And Tommy looked outside and go, yeah, I see a tree. And then the teacher said, Tommy, do you see the grass outside? And Tommy goes, yeah, I see the grass. And teacher said, go outside quickly and take a look up in the sky to see if the sky is there. So Tommy did as she said, and he came in and he said, yep, I see the sky. And she said, then did you see God when you looked up into the sky? And he goes, no. She said, that's my point. We can't see God because he isn't there. He just doesn't exist. So a little girl sitting nearby Tommy asked the teacher, can I ask Tommy some questions? And so the teacher obliged and she said, sure, you can ask him some questions. So the little girl, she said, Tommy, did you see the tree outside? Yes, I see the tree outside. She said, then did you see the grass? And he goes, yes, I saw the grass. I think I've heard this question before. And the little girl said, did you see the sky? And he says, yes, I saw the sky. And then the little girl said, do you see the teacher? And little Tommy goes, yeah, I see the teacher. And then she said, did you see her brain? And he said, no, I didn't see her brain. Then according to what our teacher taught us today in school, that she must not have one. You see, if it doesn't exist, if you can't see it, right? Anyways, do you get it? Anyways, so here's the king. He's not doing too well. He either had indigestion from eating too much at supper or who knows what, but he didn't ask for the court jester to come and crack him some jokes. He didn't ask for the queen's company to come to him. He unexpectedly, and perhaps in a monotone voice, we don't really know, but in some kind of afflection, he asked for a book to be read. And the reason he probably asked for a book to be read is so that it might induce his sleep. You know what happens if you have the TV on sometimes and you hear the tones and it puts you out. Anyways, the book chosen by his attendant was not a very interesting storybook. Really, it wasn't a fairy tale, but it was a boring court document and a palace historical record. Coincidental? I think not. The next coincidence was that the king didn't search for the particular passage himself. He had one of his attendants do that. And of the thousands of accounts and stories that are inside this historical book, the attendants happened to choose to read the account of Mordecai, his astuteness, his bravery, his sacrifice for saving the king's life. So now the king's eunuchs or officers or attendants, those are all the same words for the same people. They were kind of a rather controversial but powerful bunch. Do you remember? Actually, in chapter 1, they were directly responsible for Vashti's dismissal. Get her out of the kingdom. In chapter 2, they were directly responsible for getting Esther into the kingdom. And then later in chapter 2, they were responsible for the attempted assassination of the king. And so while the attendants had no choice but to read something, the king asked, how hard and how unlikely was it for them to find this story of all the stories that are there, especially the account of a Jewish hero spoken now from the lips of these Babylonian professionals who were standing before the king. Now, if I were one of these attendants, I would be once I saw the story, I'd be kind of careful. Why? Well, I would not want to hint that someone of my professional standing or that these of my cohorts were the bad guys implicated in a plot to kill the king. Kind of a dangerous territory to go. So then there's a third coincidence that happens. All of a sudden, as the king is asking the questions, he hears a rustling in the outer court, and he's going, who's there? And it turned out to be Haman. Strange, right? So this boost in this chapter of coincidences come now not only from Haman being there, but from what Haman was about to say. Haman had come in the middle of the night or early morning. We don't know the exact hour, but we do know that the king was supposed to be asleep, right? So he was coming not at a normal time to conference with the king. He was there when the king was supposedly sleeping and when the palace and everything was kind of settled down. The king had not extended his scepter to him to allow him into his presence. And the attendants who were there with their precariously jaded history, rightly and wisely, didn't offer the king any advice on the matter. They were more happy to hand the job over to Haman to figure out what to do to honor this person named Mordecai. So here it is, early in the morning, Haman so obsessed, so fixated on hanging Mordecai that he didn't care if the king was sleeping or not. And he didn't care to ask the right question to find out who the beneficiary of this new anointed blessing of the king was supposed to be upon. Of all the places to go, Haman charged into the wrong place at the wrong time. He's in the outer court of the palace early in the morning. He assumed, though, that he was the right person in the right place at the right time. But Haman then, in this conversation that we'll catch in just a moment, got caught up buttering the king so good, and he painted a picture for the king, who was kind of half asleep, of the sight and the smell of this parade in the streets that was about to take place, that the king actually agreed with Haman's suggestion. Outlandish, unprecedented, and almost an impossible task to ever implement. And so Haman, he seized on these words that are actually mentioned in the text 3 times about the delight that the king had for this person who was about to receive this unusual blessing. So in verse 7, we pick it up. God opposes the proud. So verse 7, he replied, if the king wishes to honor someone, remember he's thinking it's about himself. If the king wishes to honor someone, he should bring out one of the king's own royal robes, as well as a horse that the king himself has ridden, one with a royal emblem on its head, and let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let him see that the man whom the king wishes to honor is dressed in the king's robes and led through the city square on the king's horse. Have the official shout as they go, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Excellent, said King Xerxes. Quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. And so Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. Could Hollywood have written such a script? I doubt. an auto dealer in Terrace was struggling. He was about to go into bankruptcy. And so last week he found himself, as the waters had receded from the river, walking through the park on the island. And as he was walking along the water, there was a glass jar there. And so he kicked the jar, and boom, up from the jar came this genie. And the genie said, "Thank you so much for letting me go. I'll grant you one request." And so the auto dealer said, well, he said, "I want to be the only foreign car dealer in a large metropolitan area." And done, the genie said. And so immediately the car dealer found himself in this glass-walled ivory tower out looking over this expansive city. And he goes, "Oh." And so he says to his secretary, "Tell me, what cars am I selling and where am I?" And his secretary said, "Boss, you're the only Volkswagen dealer in downtown Tokyo." Let that sink in for a moment. George MacDonald probably said it better when he said this: "In whatever a man does without God, he must fail miserably or succeed miserably." Haman sure knew how to help himself to the king's very best, didn't he? His most expensive and desirable real estate, his classic trademarks, his finest belongings, and this ego-inflated, cunning advisor to the king asked for the very best of the very best from the king. See, Haman was interested in recognition, not reward, and in grandiosity, not in just generalities, and in style. He wasn't interested in substance. And so the robe that's first mentioned here wasn't merely a single piece of outer cloth or outer tunic. It meant a whole wardrobe. A wardrobe. The same word is translated earlier in Esther as garments, plural. And so Haman had all the royal treatment, all the royal trimmings planned for himself. He had the vest, he had the extras, he had the double-breasted suit or the three-piece suit. He was dressed to the nines, and he wanted to be decked out from head to toe for everyone to see him. That was his wish. Now, see, Haman had an excellent, exquisite, and expensive taste. The crown that was going to go, what he thought, on his head was the same crown that was used for Vashti and for Esther, the same type. It had to be the same design. It had to be the same engraving, the supplier, the quality, the technique, the price, the impression, the beauty. And Haman also made sure that the royal robes that he thought he was going to wear wasn't an ordinary bathrobe like you and I might wear to lounge around in the house. No, it had to be cut from the very same cloth as the cloth that was fit for the king, and cut from the same. So the horse that he had his eyes on was the king's horse. Haman had his own horse, but he wanted the king's horse for himself, not some out-of-commission Seabiscuit. And so the King James Version actually translates this kind of uniquely. He said, "The horse that the king rideth upon." The horse that the king rideth upon. Not just from the same stable, not just the same breed, but the same horse. Haman really dreamed big. He was going all out. Could it get any better? He wanted the horse that the king was riding. And how was it that Haman now ended up eventually with leading the parade, since he wasn't a prince of any kind? In verse 9, so the word is kind of, the word here for this prince is kind of the generic word for a person in charge. So it's kind of the same word for chief butler or chief baker, or the captain of the guard. And so at this point, he made the big mistake of actually not thinking big enough. You see, he could have actually asked for the king himself to be the one who would parade him around, or maybe Queen Vashti, or maybe a prince or somebody else within the royal family to do that. But no, he didn't think big enough. And so again, the egotistic Haman wasn't that thick-skinned enough to ask for a king's relative to walk the streets and holler like mad and pave the way. So now we begin to see that God also offends the proud. Verse 10. Excellent, the king said to Haman, quick, take the robes and my horse and do just as you have said for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the gate of the palace. Leave out nothing you have suggested. And so Haman took the robes and put them on Mordecai, placed him on the king's own horse, and led him through the city square, shouting, this is what the king does for someone he wishes to honor. And afterward Mordecai returned to the palace gate. But Haman hurried home, dejected and completely humiliated. And when Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends what had happened, his wise advisors and his wife said, since Mordecai, this man who has humiliated you, is of Jewish birth, you will never succeed in your plans against him now. It'll be fatal to continue opposing him. And while they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and quickly took Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Remember, this was day 2 now of the banquet feast. A number of years ago, a fellow by the name of Richard Parsons assumed the role as chair of and CEO of AOL Time Warner. Now, most of you today have no idea what those two companies were, AOL and Time Warner, but in 2002, these two mega companies merged to form this new leading largest media empire in the world. And Richard Parsons gets to lead this thing. Who's he? Well, in 1971, he had the highest score of anybody in the New York State bar exam. He ended up becoming an advisor to the New York governor, Nelson Rockefeller, and to President Gerald Ford. And then in 1977, he transformed his life from the legal profession now to the banking industry, which then culminated in his present appointment in the lucrative entertainment industry as the chief guru of entertainment. So then Fortune magazine asked Parsons to submit an article on the subject of the best advice I ever got. The best advice I ever got. So Parsons said the best business advice he ever received was from Steve Ross, who used to run this company. Steve was a friend. It was in 1991 or 1992, and I was on the Time Warner board. And I was going to be coming over to the company from the banking industry, and we were talking about how to get things done. And Steve said to me, Dick, always remember this is a very small business and a long life. You are going to see all these guys come and go around and around again and again. So how you treat them on each individual transaction is going to make an impression in the long haul. He said, when you do deals, leave a little something to make everybody happy instead of trying to grab every nickel off the table for yourself. Thomas Fuller probably puts it best this way. He said, praise makes good men better and bad men worse. Can you imagine how surprised and offended Haman was when the king announced Mordecai? But it wasn't just any Mordecai. It couldn't be any clearer. It was Mordecai the Jew, but it wasn't just Mordecai the Jew, of which there were probably thousands of Mordecai the Jews. It's not unlike the name John. John, who hangs out at the gates of Canadian Tire. No, this was Mordecai who hangs out at the gate of the king. Haman raised his eyebrows, no doubt, stunned in silence. Did I just hear this right? And gulped, bit his tongue. The king's got to be mistaken. It cannot be. How in the world did Mordecai's name get mixed up in this? I'm about to be honored and celebrated as one of the king's most favorite people. And Mordecai's, what is going on? Mordecai, he's a guy with no home. He's a guy with no manners, according to Haman. And this is a guy with no future. He's going to die a couple of months down the road anyways. So poor Haman, he didn't even have time to go home and tell his wife or change his clothes. The king says, go and do it right now. And so here Haman, remember who he is, Haman, second most powerful person in the empire. Remember, he actually wore the signet ring on his finger, so he had the power. And he ends up dragging his feet through the dusty streets of Susa in the hot sun, shouting words to strangers and visiting neighborhoods and the suburbs and cul-de-sacs of everyday folk. And as he paves the way for Mordecai and he's pacing the streets, he's racking his brain going, what on earth? This is what the king does for who the king wants to honor, but this is the guy I want to kill. This is the guy that I've got such a harbored hate for. What am I supposed to do? And he's thinking about how he could cause trouble to Mordecai, and how's he going to hang him now, and what am I going to do with those gallows I built the other day, and where am I going to put it? And with all of a sudden turn of events going on, he knew that he couldn't touch or hurt Mordecai in any way, because Mordecai was now under the proxy protection of the king. What is he to do? He instantly knew he was in trouble. What if word got out and found out that that Haman was trying to kill one of the Jews, and a Jew in particular, and particularly one who is now the new best friend of the king? Ooh. And so after this public humiliation on his part, he races home to see what his wife and friends would have to say. Maybe they had some more ideas. They had some good ideas the other day. Maybe they got some more good ideas today. Maybe all's not lost. But again, something happened that might be lost to ordinary eyes. The first time the word rushed is used in the book of Esther was when the edict to kill the Jews was issued in verse 12. And so this word rushed, or spurred on, as some translations put it, by the king's command to have the Jews killed. And now it had come full circle. It had come back to Haman, who was now the one rushing or hastening home, even covering his head. And little did he know how this story was going to end up, and we'll find out in a couple of weeks what that looks like. But the people who were now backing him before, and who were so certain as what to do, now said the opposite, and they weren't so certain anymore. His hope of comforting words was dashed, and then they mentioned the words fall. Fall. It occurs 3 times in verse 13. Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin, which is actually the word fall, double fall in Hebrew. Of course, the proud one didn't think about repentance. He didn't think of throwing himself at the king's or Mordecai's feet for mercy, nor did he think of making friends with Mordecai. He could have gone, oh, okay, I better change course here. Didn't think of that. Pride again got in his way. Pride is actually one of the most deadliest of the 7 deadly sins, because in pride, we always fall short of the glory of God. So how do we bring this home for us here today? What does it mean? How do we interpret these events, and how do we now begin to make deposits of God's rich grace and mercy and goodness into our souls today? What does God want to implant into you? I want you to know this. Help and honor always await the humble. Help and honor always await the humble. Mordecai, he never sought or pursued honor for himself. Nowhere. He never sought it for himself. He was content to sit and drink coffee with the boys at the gate of the king, and then do what he could to try to help his Jewish brothers and sisters. He never declared his humility. He never said, I'm a pretty humble dude. He proved his humility by simply being the right person in the right time at the right place, which God will always exalt and raise up at some point, always. You see, Mordecai's vision was never clouded with self-interest. He never had a desire other than to love God and to serve his people. Kind of sounds like Terrace Alliance Church. Loving God and serving others together. That was the centerpiece of his mind, of his thoughts, of his life. It was as it was for Esther. You see, our welfare is always in God's hand and in his heart, and he will always orchestrate our circumstances, often painful at times, we must admit, and at times feeling unbearable, to be a catalyst, though, for his divine purposes, and he will raise us up at the right time as he deems best. However, when we try to elevate ourselves, when we try to make ourselves look good, when we try to serve our own self-interest, and when we try to manipulate Haman, what was he doing? He was trying to manipulate the king to meet his desired goals. We may succeed, but we will do so miserably. The outcome is never good when we try to do it our way. Frank Sinatra, I think that's what he's saying, right? I'll do it my way. It's never the right way. You see, the house of cards will eventually fall. A house built on sand will not stand against the windstorms of life, and we will never experience God's peace when we try to live our life on our terms, rather than accepting hardship as the pathway to peace. And so I want you to anchor this morning your life around this thought today. God amazingly is at work through the coincidences of your life, the circumstances that surround you, and the choices that you daily make. Always there. And so humble yourself this morning before God, and in due time he will lift you up. His help will come, it will arrive, and guess what? It will come from very unexpected sources, unwilling partners, and unseen for it. Can you imagine for a moment Mordecai getting this word from Haman? Mordecai, I'm going to set you up in the king's horse. Mordecai, I'm going to put new robes on you. They're actually the same robes that the king wears. Mordecai, I'm going to march you around town. And Mordecai must have been going, this is the guy that's trying to kill me. He wants to honor me. But he did. And so anchor your life as you humble yourself, because God's response to you will come out of the blue. It will sometimes shock you. It will sometimes cause you to double blink and go, what? What's going on? You see, God is for you. He's not against you. And our God does not fall asleep. He's not falling asleep at the wheel of your life. He's awake. He's alert. He's attentive. He's active. And when we put our trust there in him, even though we cannot see him, we sense his spirit moving and orchestrating his big picture and his big plan and the part that we get to play in the development and establishment of his kingdom here on earth. It's beautiful. We know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. That we have to read the whole verse. God causes all things to work together for good. Sometimes we put the period there. That's not true. God causes all things to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. And so if you put yourself in the place of being open to God's divine intervention and his work in your life, even though we can't see him, as we walk in obedience, God will be pleased to do the rest and to orchestrate things that we could not orchestrate. There is no way Mordecai could ever have orchestrated this. Never in 100 billion years would it have happened. But God caused what was meant for harm to actually work out for good. That's our God. That's what he does. And so as we align ourselves to him today, we will succeed. Why? Because God succeeds, and his plans will never fail. Well, here we are, 12:05, a little long, but we're good. It was a great day. And so may God bless you. May you experience the fullness of his grace today. And may you know his joy. And as Kondwani reminds us, may we be filled with happiness and joy in the Lord. So let's stand together